Hello, AMP Honors Program. We are here today to review the book When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. I'm Nick Visser.
And I'm Riley Kuhn, and I believe this is your AMP Honors debut, correct? At least video-wise.
It is my debut. It's an honor to be on. Brief intro, I am a second-year medical student at the Medical College of Wisconsin and a recent addition to the AMP Honors Program team, so glad to be on board.
Yeah, and we're glad to have you. All right, so a little bit about the book. This is the cover. I think it's a pretty cool cover. I don't know. Maybe the hardcover looks different. I'm not sure what you got, but
we got two different covers here.
So When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. A little bit about Paul first. He was a neurosurgeon and writer. He held degrees in English literature, biology, history, and then philosophy of science and medicine from Stanford, Cambridge, and then he went to the Yale School of Medicine. So he's one of those high achievers, I guess you could say. Similar to Atul Gawande, he unfortunately passed away in March of 2015 at the age of 37 after a battle with cancer. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And that's kind of what the book is all about. He's survived by his wife, Lucy, and his daughter, Elizabeth Acadia, who I believe, I don't think his daughter even, I don't know, was his daughter even like 1 year old when he passed? She was
still an infant. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's a relatively quick read, I thought. And to me, it kind of stood out to me because it's obviously a nonfiction and it's just him kind of writing about his experiences, but it almost read at times like a fiction to me. I also want to point out that I'm not a necrophiliac. I realize that 2 out of 3 book reviews I've done have been about death and dying, but I promise it's not my favorite topic by any means. In comparison with Being Mortal, I think it is it's an interesting comparison because Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, if you haven't seen that, it's a super statistical, anecdotal, persuasive approach to death and dying in general, where he's just kind of talking about more how do we improve those that are dying, I guess, how do we improve their lives? And this one is a lot more just personal, and he did a good job kind of putting his mind onto the paper kind of thing, and just everything that he was going through. I thought that was really interesting. So with that, I'll read the back of the book and then I'll let Nick take over with some of the top talking points. At the age of 36, on the verge of completing a decade's training as a neurosurgeon, Paul Kalanithi was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. One day he was a doctor treating the dying, the next he was a patient struggling to live. When Breath Becomes Air chronicles Kalanithi's transformation from a medical student in search of what makes a virtuous and meaningful life into a neurosurgeon working in the core of human identity, the brain, and finally into a patient and a new father.
Excellent. I think that's a great description to get us started here. And I think that 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So as long as we get something not death related next time, you'll be all right.
Right.
Our fan base will be happy. But no, I think you bring up a great point, in particular about his background and how it was so diverse. I think so often when we're reading these books, we are looking for new perspectives to form ourselves into more competent positions or whatever that might be. And the really unique perspective he brings here is that he comes from an interest in the humanities and moral philosophy. And he discusses very early on in the book that he is going into medicine because he wants to have those experiences which help him understand morality better, which I think is so unique. It's not going and saying, I want to help people. It's I want to understand what helping people means. And it's very inspiring to me, and I think gives a lot of motivation even when you're in the education process, when things can be a total slog and you keep moving. So that's one of the coolest things in this book. And if you do read it or if you have read it, I think something that you can pull away from this experience. Also, one of the really cool things early on in the book is his description as a medical student of the anatomy lab process, something that I've gone through and I know Riley's in right now. It's such you definitely come more in terms with your own mortality in that process when you are around these body donors who have given that to us to learn from, and you see them as a real person. It's not something really you can really understand until you're there, and he does such a good job of explaining what that's like. So for students who haven't maybe gone through that or are interested in what that's like, he does an incredible job of describing it, and I think that's a cool thing to take away from it as well. And obviously, one of the biggest the biggest parts of his story is he becomes ill, right? And he is a physician who's about to finish his training. He's going into the top of his field, a neurosurgeon, and yet he becomes the patient. And it teaches so many lessons about what that patient-doctor relationship looks like because he's been on both ends. And something that's really cool is that it becomes very clear. It's not the binary that a lot of people would maybe want it to think, like either the patient needs to be fully in control of their care or the physician needs to be. There's this give and take between him and his oncologist that's really incredible. And sometimes he has to, submit himself to her authority, even though he probably feels like he knows more than her some of the times. And then vice versa, right? Sometimes he has to be able to do that, to do his own research and pull out his own conclusions. So cool to see that, and something that obviously situation I hope to never be in and never wish anyone else, but brings so much interesting perspective, as we talked about earlier, to this.
Yeah, and you mentioned like not wanting to be in it, and no one obviously does, and no one wants anyone else to, but it's just kind of a fact of life that some people do have that happen to them, and being like I guess open and honest and kind of vulnerable in that setting is really important, I think. And I think he did obviously a fantastic job of that, and it was such an interesting read. I want to go back to what you said about cadavers. We are in the middle of dissection now. I was just there, and it wasn't, so I was just a personal anecdote. It wasn't like bad for me at all until I dissected the hand. And it's interesting because I wouldn't have thought that the hand would be like where I had that realization, I guess. But it was such an intimate thing to hold kind of the donor's hand as I was like, for lack of a better term, like skinning the hand. It was so real at that moment that like this was somebody's whole life. With the oncologist thing, I thought that was one of the like, I guess, funnier parts of the book, if that's the right word for it. But he would kind of go back and forth with the oncologist, and there's actually a quote from an article that he wrote in January of 2014. So this is a little over a year before he passed. But it was called "How Long Have I Got Left?" I believe it was for the New York Times. The quote was, "Now, instead of wondering why some patients persist in asking statistics questions, I began to wonder why physicians obfuscate when they have so much knowledge and experience." And so he was referring to his oncologist, who notoriously wouldn't discuss like the Kaplan-Meier survival curves with him, because that was all he wanted to know. It was like, what are my chances? What are the stats? Tell me the stats. But her expertise as the oncologist was she wouldn't kind of back down from that, and I thought that was cool. She didn't just give in to what he wanted, which it's kind of a touchy subject because you want what the patient wants, but she thought at that time that she knew what was best for him, and that wasn't to like talk about the Kaplan-Meier survival curves, because she knows that they're just stats. And stats are important, obviously, in medicine in a lot of ways, but in this particular setting, I don't know how worthwhile it is to kind of use your time talking about that kind of stuff. So I'm glad you touched on that.
Right. Yeah, it's this juxtaposition between we need everything to be data driven, all the decisions we make, but also no person is just that point of data. They're still their whole own set of experiences. So that oncology sounds hard. Props to people doing that, because that's a tough place to be in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just it's not like at some point you can't just use stats. It's almost lazy sometimes to just use stats, just because there's so much more that goes into it all than just the numbers. So yeah, I love this book. 5 out of 5 stars, 10 out of 10, whatever ranking system you want. But I would definitely recommend this book to anyone interested in medicine or not necessarily. Similar to Being Mortal, it just kind of touches on a lot of the things that people go through when they know that their life might be cut short.
Absolutely. And I have to echo that, so succinct, so action-packed, full of meaning. I personally am a slow reader. And so for all my slow readers out there, this is a perfect book. Like Riley said, only like a little over 200 pages, and every word means something. He's very poetic and very, very cogent in what he says.
Yeah. So that was When Breath Becomes Air. by Paul Kalanithi.
This has been a presentation of the CV Academics Foundation, home of the AMP Honors Program.